Yeah, that's right. Now I've done a book on the 1997 season, the only year we had two rugby league competitions in Australasia, and I'm doing a little launch tonight, Wednesday night, at St Heliers Bay at the Pigeon from 5:30, and quite a few luminaries are threatening to show up. So yeah, I'm pretty excited because this is obviously a very important place for the game's history and that year as well, of course, with the Warriors being in Super League, but it being a pretty divided club back then, wasn't it? With plenty of people wanted to go back to the ARL. So, yeah, I'm really, really thrilled to be here.
Ultimately, was it good or bad for rugby league, that year-long war?
Yeah, I was just with the legendary Ray Haffenden, who I know as a former Kiwis team manager, but the listeners would know he's done just about everything from playing upwards in rugby league in this country. And he asked me the same question, and I think it broke up a lot of sort of cronyism in the game, some favouritism that was obviously kicking around where there were the establishment clubs in Sydney, and Sydney kind of ran things. So I think that was a good thing, but nevertheless, the big question, which I don't think anyone can answer, is what would have happened if we hadn't had the war, and some of the clubs that have survived. Probably wouldn't have, and some of the clubs that haven't survived might still be around today because it depended which way you jumped and when you jumped. So the answer to that question depends on which club you support and what in rugby league you hold dear and which things that you don't think are so important. It's not an easy question to answer. It depends on your perspective.
Ultimately, though, they came back together for 1998. So 1996 was, what we look at now called the NRL. 97, of course, there were two separate competitions going on. Came back 98. How important then that it didn't linger and it did get resolved?
Yeah, the ARL and Super League, end up forming a joint venture. And until the second decade of this century, News Corp had the first right of refusal on TV rights as a result of that peace deal, and that probably restricted the game's income really, because there was limited competition for those rights. But no, anyone who is old enough to remember. Us oldies remember that people were losing a lot of interest in the sport, weren't they, back in 96, 97? And, if it hadn't been for Newcastle winning that competition, that was the shining light, really, the sort of working class steel town, the last place left that still cared about the sport, actually won the ARL competition that year. And that gave the ARL some bargaining chips when they went to the table with News. And perhaps it's the biggest reason why we still have a competition that's recognisable compared to what we had before. Otherwise, if it had gone a different way, perhaps the competition today might look a bit more like Super League. It was supremely important, mate, because, I think rugby league was sinking from the centre of popular culture in 1997, and I think that demise would have continued if we had have continued with dual competitions in 98.
Steve Mascord is with us. He appears at St Heliers Bay tonight, 5:30. The book Two Tribes: the untold story of the Super League War and the birth of the NRL. It's when you mention the Knights beating Manly and Darren Albert, of course, it was Joey Johns, that inside pass and all of that. I bet I could ask 100 league fans who won the Super League and who did they play, and I bet 99 or so forth wouldn't actually remember, because it was Brisbane against Cronulla. But the thing is the ARL final got all the attention and seems to have been the final that everyone remembers. Why is that?
Yeah, for the reasons I mentioned, a lot of people thought that the Super League competition, people who don't care about business, sort of thought that Super League was just set up for Brisbane, and so Brisbane could win, wish it was that simple. But that is what happened, right? So it's exactly what everyone expected happened in the Super League competition. And whereas we had a team winning the competition against the odds, they'd lost the last 10, 11, 12 times they'd played Manly. They were considered no hope. And as I said, Newcastle still cared about rugby league because they hadn't had any success before. So one story was very compelling and one story was pretty predictable. And that's why. Although, I think Super League did contribute to the sort of annals of the game as far as great contests that year with that Tri-Series final that went for 111 minutes, and Noel Goldthorpe kicked a field goal. It's still the longest game of first-class rugby league ever played. So it's not to say that Super League was completely legless when it came to putting on entertainment or putting on memorable games, but that is the most important grand final of all time. I've got no doubt about that. And, alongside one or two others, it's also the best.
I'm going to run you through the Super League clubs. And, people, this is really important to remember. Auckland Warriors, okay, they're still there. The Broncos are there. The Raiders are there. The Dogs are there. The Panthers are there. The Cowboys are there, and the Sharks are there. So out of the 8 teams, there are still 6 of them, or 5 or 6 of them that are there. Obviously, the Hunter Mariners aren't there. The Adelaide Rams, the Perth Reds. Was that the end of Australia thinking that the NRL could actually be a continent-wide competition?
Well, I think it was the end of it as we speak now, 25 years later. Whether they revisit that is another matter. But yeah, I think back then, Martin, if you remember, that a lot of people thought the American model for professional sports was going to be the one that would prevail everywhere eventually. So we all thought that one town, one team was an inevitability, and we didn't know as much as we do now about IP. We didn't know that a jersey and colours would actually be bankable things like they are now. So back then, South Sydney players were picking weeds at Redfern Oval before training because they couldn't pay a groundsman to do it. And we all thought of South Sydney as a struggling inner-city club that was on borrowed time. Of course, we know what happened since. And what happened since is why the NRL aren't going to mark their 25th anniversary this year. They're not making a big deal of it because they kick Souths out and they don't want to remind people of that. So it's just you and me who have to remind people of that. But now, Hollywood movie stars wear South Sydney caps and all that sort of stuff. And it isn't so important where the teams are. It's more important what their identity is. So we've got more of an English appreciation of professional sport where you can have 2 clubs very close together. As long as you've got enough TV money, you can prop the clubs up, and they don't have to be in Perth. They don't, and you can just play games in Perth, State of Origins in Adelaide, etc., etc., etc. So our whole understanding of the way professional sport works has changed in the last 25 years. And you're right. Peter V'landys is the chairman of the NRL, and he said 5.5 hours is too long on a plane for a professional sportsman. Well, what's the N stand for if you can't travel to Perth? I just thought it was an outrageous comment.
Yeah. Look, and I'm just looking at the 1997 ARL clubs here. Manly stay, Gold Coast stay, St George and Illawarra combined, Parramatta stay, North Sydney and Manly actually combined, Newcastle stay, but Western Suburbs and Balmain combined. So in the end, South Sydney stayed, even though they tried to kick them out, of course. So in the end, a lot of those clubs, the ARL clubs, did they have to combine?
Yeah, well, I mean, Gold Coast and Souths, as you mentioned, went out and came back in again. It's a different Gold Coast team now. But yeah, so the News Limited teams were already sorted financially. There was a meeting on December 19, 1997 at the Sydney Football Stadium where they all agreed to go into business with News Limited, and they did so because they were broke. They did so because their own TV deal with Optus Vision, which no longer exists, was expiring, and they really didn't have a choice. So that is the reason that the Sydney Super League clubs survive in their own right, and a lot of the New South Wales ARL clubs are forced to merge. It's because basically News Limited guaranteed the futures of those Super League clubs. That's not to say that Penrith and Canterbury and Cronulla weren't pressured. They were. I mean, I had a book launch at Cronulla where Peter Gow showed up and they talked about going to peace meetings with St George and going to merger meetings with St George and the fact that the Super League teams were under some pressure to merge, but they didn't have to in the end. And that's right. The ARL clubs were more susceptible to financial pressure, much more susceptible to financial pressure and having to make those tough decisions than the Super League clubs were.
Steve Mascord is with us. 2 Tribes, the untold story of the Super League war, the rebirth of the NRL. You lost Western Suburbs 90 seasons, you lost Balmain 90 seasons, you lost North Sydney 90 seasons. Is that good or bad for the competition? What I'm trying to get at is, I mean, there are diehard fans from all of those clubs. Look, I was a Balmain fan, mate, which is why I patched over to the Warriors because I hated West so much. I didn't want anything to do with them. And a lot of Balmain fans actually felt like that. I know that this is a lost generation now. We're all getting old and our voices, become tired and boring, and the TikTok generation don't really give a stuff about us. But is there something lost or not? Or should we just all move on from that?
Yeah, well, I'm an Illawarra fan, Martin.
There you
So
go. Okay.
our club's been gone. Our club's gone longer than it was ever around. So how old do you think that makes me feel? Yeah, I think obviously something was lost because, as I said, we now see the value of IP in sport and how old something is and how we feel emotionally attached to a set of colours or an emblem. And back then it was as we were more in an American mindset where it was, we're going to move clubs around the map like chess pieces on a chessboard. And basically these it was like it was. And it's not a good thing to. I don't want to compare sport to seismology, especially at the moment with the tragic events overseas. But it was like there was just this moving of these plates, which had been dormant for as you said 90 years, and you were lucky if you made the right call or you woke up on the wrong side of the bed, and you were unlucky if you didn't during this period. And certainly brands like Balmain and Wests and Norths and St George's, the standalone club, they have enormous value, and that IP has definitely been lost to the game. And the location of clubs doesn't matter as much as it did back then because now we have TV rights, as I said, and the central body pays each club more than the total cost of the players. So the entire salary of every club is more than covered by the central funding. So yeah, it was wasteful, and in an ideal world, you would not have done it that way. I agree with you completely.
Steve Mascord with us. The only parallel I can draw people to modern day times is the Live Golf and the PGA. And it's got, there is no parallel. I mean, these are worlds apart. But what you've got is this nasty internal war going on in a sport where players are, well, I was going to say they're being asked to choose. They're being paid to choose. I mean, let's be honest about it. The brown paper bag stuff that went on, is that ever going to be admitted? Players clubs, coaches ever go? I know it went on. You know it went on. I've got players that have actually told me that they walked into a meeting. There was a bag in the corner. Nobody said anything. They just picked it up and walked out with it. There were safes full of cash, and that's how these deals all got done. And some of the players, I don't need to name them, but some of the players said to me they got paid telephone numbers. Does all of that need to come out now? I mean, do we need to actually just pick the scab off that and be honest about it?
Well, I don't think this is the worst period in the game's history for that sort of behaviour, Martin, because there was no salary cap. When the Super League war broke out, it was open what players were being paid. It came out in court. There was no rules that needed to be broken or no secrets that needed to be kept. I think that sort of stuff more happened after, when we tried to bring everything back within a salary cap. We had notional salary caps, and the 1999 grand final was St George Illawarra, who were basically, two whole clubs who they were allowed to spend more than the cap. They had notional value to fit them inside the cap. And of course Melbourne, which was basically Hunter Mariners and Perth, with a few Gold Coast players and a few people from London Broncos as well. Again, they were openly allowed to spend more than the cap so that the club could get off the ground. And so the two teams spending the most played in the 1999 grand final. I think some of the paper bag stuff you're talking about more happened before the war and since the war, because we had salary caps or because we had other restrictions that people had to be dishonest. But during this period, you could be openly greedy. It was celebrated. That's the whole thing. It was about greed. This period. So I don't think, as I said, if you want to find out what people are being paid 95, 96, 97, you just got to look in the paper because all the figures were published.
Steve Mascord, what a fantastic idea for a book. Every league fan, you got to get this and read it. It's a historical account, but it involves so much more than that. It's a soap opera as well. It's underhanded, it's devious, there's dodgy dealings, there's villains, there's heroes, there's characters all over the joint. Two Tribes, the untold story of the Super League war and the birth of the NRL. If people want to get hold of a copy of this, you and me, we'd go into a bookshop and we'd ask somebody behind a counter. That doesn't happen these days, mate. What's the best way to get hold of it?
Yeah, it's not that easy anymore for a lot of reasons I won't bore the listeners with. But the best way to get hold of it is by going to stevemascord.com/product/2 tribes. It's also available on Amazon. You might find it on Trade Me or eBay or stuff like that. But the easiest way to get a copy straight from me and I won't sign it because the value goes down if I sign it. But it's Steve Mascord. stevemascord.com/product/2 tribes. And of course, if anyone's listening in Auckland and they want to come tonight, there'll be some people there. I hope I'm not going to drop any names in case they don't show up, but I'm thinking there'll be some people there who you will want to sign it. You won't want my signature in it, but there'll be some genuine, stars of the year of 2 tribes, hopefully there tonight.